Hello, and welcome back to Creepy Chronicles. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love reading every single one. If you enjoy Creepy Chronicles filled with spine-chilling horror, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now get comfortable. Dim the lights if you dare. Relax your mind. Let the outside world fade away. And let's begin. Story 1, Grandmother was dying. The woman who had once seemed stronger than anyone in our family was slowly fading away in the bedroom at the end of the hall. When I was a small child, she had towered over me like one of the old trees surrounding our farm. Her back had always been straight, her shoulders broad from years of carrying baskets, lifting tools, and working the soil. Her hands were rough and covered in thick skin. Whenever she held my face between her palms, it felt as though I were being touched by pieces of old leather. Nothing had ever seemed capable of defeating her. But that night, I knew she was going to die. I knew because I had seen the banshee. Grandmother had told us about the banshee many times. She said it was a spirit that followed certain families through generations. It did not kill people itself. It did not enter houses and steal souls. It simply appeared when death was close. There was a warning. According to Grandmother, the banshee usually appeared as an ancient woman dressed in white. Her body was bent with age, and her face was covered in deep wrinkles. She was cursed to cry forever. Tears flowed endlessly from her swollen red eyes, running down her cheeks like rivers. Her mouth always hung open, frozen in a scream that never ended. Not everyone could see her, Grandmother told us, but almost anyone could hear her. And if a person was unlucky enough to hear the banshee's full wail, there was no point in running. The sound meant death had already chosen someone. Grandmother loved telling the story late at night, usually when the wind was striking the windows and the fire in the sitting room had burned low. She would lean forward in her chair, lower her voice, and describe the spirit in terrible detail. My sister hated it. She would cover her ears and beg Grandmother to stop. But Grandmother only laughed. She would clap her thin, claw-like fingers together and cackle with cruel delight whenever my sister cried. I was different. I loved the story. The banshee frightened me, but in the same way, storms frightened me. There was something exciting about it. I believed it was only an old tale, passed down through families to explain sudden death and bad luck. To me, it was no different from the stories of witches, demons, or strange lights that led travelers into the woods. I never truly believed a banshee could exist. Then, I saw her. My family lived on a farm far from the nearest village. Life there was difficult, but it was the only life I knew. We woke before sunrise and worked until the sky became dark. There were always animals to feed, fields to prepare, fences to repair, and heavy things that needed to be moved from one place to another. By the end of most days, every part of my body hurt. Still, the work was worth it. Our cows gave rich, creamy milk. Our vegetables grew large and healthy. In summer, the fields became so green that they looked like a small piece of heaven. My sister and I grew up running barefoot through the grass, breathing clean country air and carrying a permanent color in our cheeks. The work made us strong. One afternoon, I carried a bale of hay across the yard. It was almost as large as I was, and its rough edges scratched my neck and cheek. "Where do you want this?" I called to Father. He was standing near the barn with a pitchfork in his hands. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. "Next to the barn, love," he replied. The cows need feeding. I carried the bale where he had pointed and dropped it onto the ground. It landed with a heavy bounce, sending dust and bits of dry grass into the air. Mother had been watching me from the doorway. I felt her disapproval before she even spoke. "I wish you wouldn't push the girls so hard," she said to Father. "Look at them. You're making them too rough." Father glanced at me, then toward my sister, who was pushing a large tractor wheel across the yard as easily as if it were a child's toy. "Too strong," Mother continued. "They're becoming too strong." Father gave a short laugh. "There's no such thing as too strong," he said. He removed his cap and wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "The work is good for them." Mother folded her arms. "They're girls." "So?" "They shouldn't have to do the work of grown men." Father's expression changed. "If you had given me sons," Mother turned and walked away before he could finish. It was an old argument. We had heard it many times. Father wanted sons to help with the farm, and Mother hated being blamed for giving birth to two daughters. Father watched her leave for a moment, then returned to his work as if nothing had happened. I picked up another bale, even though my shoulders were already aching. Father's words did not hurt me as much as they probably should have. I knew he had wanted sons. Everyone knew. But I also knew he was proud of us. He simply did not know how to say it. Instead, he showed it in strange little ways. He gave us the best pieces of meat from his plate. He allowed us to use his tools. When Mother complained that we had become too dirty or too loud, he often told her to leave us alone. The best part of each day came after the work was finished. We sat around the wooden kitchen table and ate warm bread with grandmother's homemade strawberry jam. The jam was sweet but slightly sharp, and there was nothing else in the world that tasted like it. My sister always tried to steal the whole strawberries from the jar. Every evening, without fail, grandmother caught her. She would slap my sister's fingers with a tea towel and tell her to leave some for the rest of us. My sister would complain, Father would laugh, and Mother would pretend to be angry, even though she was smiling. Those evenings felt safe. For a long time, I believed they would continue forever. Then grandmother became ill. It happened one afternoon in the fields. She had been working beside me, using a hoe to break the hard soil. Even at her age, she worked harder than many younger people. She refused to rest and became angry whenever someone offered to carry something for her. One moment, she was standing straight beneath the sun. The next, she folded in half. At first, I thought she had injured her back. Then I heard the coughing. It was not an ordinary cough. It was deep and violent, as though something inside her body were trying to claw its way out. She dropped the hoe and covered her mouth with both hands. "Grandmother?" She fell to her knees. Blood sprayed between her fingers and struck the soil. For several seconds, I could not move. I stood frozen, staring as the dark earth drank the blood. The red disappeared quickly, sinking into the ground we had worked so hard to feed and protect. Even while dying, it seemed, grandmother was still giving something to the farm. Then her body collapsed. I ran toward her, shouting for Father. Her fingers dug into the dirt as another coughing fit tore through her. Her entire body shook. Blood covered her hands, her dress, and the soil beneath her face. Father arrived before anyone else. He lifted her into his arms and carried her back to the house. Her head hung over his arm, moving loosely with every step. She looked like a cloth doll instead of the powerful woman I had known all my life. I followed him, but I could not stop looking at the bloody marks left behind in the field. I knew I would remember them forever. The doctor came later that evening. He examined grandmother for a long time, though we already knew what he was going to say. Tuberculosis, Father's younger brother, had died from the same disease. Father understood what it did to a person. It attacked the lungs. It filled them with blood and fluid until every breath felt like drowning. The sick person coughed until the throat became raw, but no amount of coughing could clear the lungs. Eventually, breathing itself became unbearable. When that happened, death was no longer the worst thing. Death became a kind of mercy. The doctor could do very little. He gave Mother instructions, left behind some medicine, and told us to prepare ourselves. That evening, Mother said my sister and I had to visit grandmother. My sister refused. She stood outside the bedroom door, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "I don't want to. You may not get another chance." Mother told her. "You need to say goodbye." My sister still would not move, so Mother placed a hand on her back and pushed her into the room. I followed. I wanted to see grandmother, but every step felt heavier than the one before it. A painful pressure had formed in my chest. I thought seeing her might make that feeling go away. Instead, I regretted entering the room almost immediately. The smell struck me first. It was sweet and sickening, like too much perfume mixed with sour milk. It filled the bedroom and clung to the inside of my nose. I tried not to breathe through my mouth because that somehow made it worse. Grandmother lay in bed with the covers pulled up to her chin. For a moment, I did not recognize her. This was not the woman who had carried me on her shoulders. It was not the woman who had worked from sunrise until evening or slapped my sister's fingers away from the jam jar. The woman in the bed looked like an empty shell. Her skin was almost white and so thin that I could see faint blue veins beneath it. Her hair had spread across the pillow in soft white strands, forming something like a broken halo around her head. Her eyes, once bright and sharp, had become dull and cloudy. As I stared, she coughed once. A drop of blood slid between her blue lips and traveled slowly down her chin. The red color was so bright against her pale skin that it became fixed in my memory. My stomach turned. My sister began crying. Her sobs were loud and sudden. Father glared at her from the other side of the room. "Quiet, girl," he hissed. "Give your granny some peace." My sister pressed both hands over her mouth. Her cries became muffled, but her shoulders still shook. I wanted to cry, too. My eyes burned, and the lump in my throat felt large enough to choke me. But Father was watching, and I wanted him to think I was strong. Mother moved around the bed, adjusting the covers and trying to give grandmother water. Most of it ran back out of her mouth and mixed with the blood on her chin. It looked like red ink spreading across wet paper. Grandmother took another breath. The sound rattled deep inside her chest. My sister finally moved closer and took grandmother's hand. She began talking about the animals, the work she had done that day, and the strawberries in the jam. They were unimportant little stories, but she kept speaking because silence was worse. I do not know whether grandmother heard her. She did not answer. She only coughed. Soon the bedside table was covered in cloth stained with blood. Some of it got onto my sister's fingers. I saw her staring at the red marks with disgust and fear. When it was my turn, I hesitated. Mother gave me a hard look, so I stepped forward and took grandmother's hand. Her skin was damp and hot. I wanted to pull away, but I forced myself to hold on. Heat seemed to rise from her entire body. Within seconds, sweat formed on my forehead. I tried to speak. I wanted to tell her she would get better. I wanted to ask her to wake up and become herself again. I wanted to say I missed hearing her laugh, but no words came. Grandmother slowly turned her head. Her cloudy eyes struggled to focus on me. For a moment, we stared at each other. I searched her face for some small sign of the woman she had been. I hoped she would smile or squeeze my fingers. Her lips opened. Her teeth were stained with blood and shone darkly in the candlelight. She whispered something too softly for me to hear, so I leaned closer. The terrible smell became stronger. Then she made a wet, horrible sound, somewhere between a gurgle and a belch. A bubble of pink saliva formed on her lower lip and burst. A sound of disgust escaped me before I could stop it. Mother clicked her tongue. Father struck the side of my head. My sister and I were sent to bed soon after that. We were given no supper and no jam, though neither of us wanted anything red after what we had seen. The house felt different that night. The darkness seemed heavier than usual. It pressed down on the roof and filled every room. My sister slept beside me, but she did not rest peacefully. She turned from side to side, sometimes whispering words I could not understand. I lay awake and listened. The house made its usual sounds. Wood groaned as it cooled. Wind brushed against the walls. Somewhere below, Father walked back and forth across the floor. Underneath those sounds came Grandmother's coughing. The bedroom walls were thin, and each wet cough traveled through the house. Every cough sounded weaker than the last. I turned toward the window. The moon had appeared from behind a cloud, spreading a pale light across the fields. The land looked strangely beautiful under that silver glow. I watched it until my eyes began to ache. Then I heard someone crying. The sound was soft at first, gentle, quiet weeping. I turned toward my sister. "Be quiet," I whispered. The crying continued. "Shut up." I reached for my pillow, planning to throw it at her. Then I stopped. My sister was curled beneath the blankets, facing the wall. She was asleep. The pillow slipped from my hand and fell to the floor. The crying continued. A cold feeling entered my stomach. Perhaps Father had gone outside to cry where no one could see him. No, the voice belonged to a woman. Mother? Why would Mother be outside our window in the middle of the night? I slowly turned back toward the glass. At first, I saw only the moonlit fields. Then I noticed someone standing near the far corner of the land. A woman in a white gown. The fabric moved wildly in the wind, twisting around her body like pale arms. Her back was facing me, and her shoulders shook with every sob. She was the one crying. It could not have been Mother. The figure moved slightly, turning until she faced my window. Even from that distance, I could see her face. She was very old, older than Grandmother. Her body was bent forward as if the weight of her years had become too heavy to carry. Her face was covered in deep wrinkles. Tears shone on her cheeks beneath the moonlight. A cough came from Grandmother's room. The old woman moved closer. She did not walk normally. She shuffled forward, her arms stretched out as though begging for help. Another cough. She came closer again. The more I stared, the more certain I became that something was wrong. There was a faint glow around her body, and her feet were not touching the ground. I quickly pulled the curtains closed. My hands shook so badly that the fabric slipped through my fingers. Even with the curtains shut, I knew she was still looking at me. I felt her eyes through the thin cloth. It seemed as if her gaze could pass through the curtains, through the wall, and into my body. I hid under the covers. My heart beat so hard that I thought it might wake my sister. Then, the crying stopped. The silence was so sudden that it felt peaceful. I released the breath I had not realized I was holding. It was only a trespasser, I told myself. Perhaps she was an old woman from the village who had become confused. She had wandered onto our land and needed help. I should tell Father, I whispered. He'll send her away. But I could not move. My legs would not obey me. Then something knocked on the window. Knock, knock, knock. The sharp sound made me gasp. It came again. Knock, knock, knock. She was outside. I slowly lifted my hand and pulled the curtain aside. The old woman's face was pressed against the glass. She had crossed the entire field in only a few seconds. Her red eyes were deep in her skull, covered in a pale film. Tears poured endlessly from them. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream. Her face showed a sadness so deep that it did not seem human. She suddenly dropped to her knees. Her hands dug into the ground beneath the window. She tore out handfuls of grass and soil as though the earth itself had caused her pain. Then her jaw opened wider, far wider than any human mouth should open. Her lips stretched until I thought the skin of her cheeks would tear. And she screamed. The wail was not a human sound. It filled the room, shook the window, and seemed to pass directly through my skull. It carried the pain of every person who had ever lost someone they loved. I pressed my hands over my ears. It made no difference. The sound was inside me. Stop! I screamed. Stop it! The old woman continued wailing. Her shoulders shook as tears flooded down her face. Her cries became deep, broken sobs. My sister did not wake. That frightened me almost as much as the woman. No one could sleep through such a sound. I should have looked away, but I could not. Something in the old woman's sorrow pulled at me. For one terrible moment, I wanted to open the window and comfort her. I wanted to reach out and ask what had happened. My hand moved toward the latch. Then a voice inside my mind warned me to stop. Every instinct I had screamed that the thing outside was not a helpless old woman. It belonged to another world, a place the living were never meant to touch. Her face seemed to change, like hot wax. Her mouth stretched again, and another wail burst from her throat. A second scream joined it. It took me several seconds to realize the second scream was mine. I was screaming with her, my voice and hers twisted together into one horrible song. I did not hear Mother enter the room. I only felt her fingers gripping my shoulders. She shook me again and again until I finally stopped screaming. I could not speak. My throat had closed. I buried my face in Mother's skirt and pointed toward the window. I expected her to scream too. Instead, she looked outside and said, "There's nothing there." I forced myself to look. She was right. The window showed only darkness. But I knew what I had seen. My ears were still ringing. I could feel the spirit's wail vibrating in my bones. Father searched the fields with his gun. He found nothing. When he returned, Mother was crying. Before she spoke, I already understood. Grandmother had died. She had passed away in her sleep only minutes earlier. That was when I realized the truth. The old woman had been a banshee. Her wail had announced grandmother's death. No one believed me. Even my sister, who had always been terrified of grandmother's stories, accused me of trying to frighten her. "You're lying," she complained. "It isn't funny." She walked away angrily, then stumbled when she saw grandmother lying in her coffin. I thought I saw the banshee again during the funeral. A pale white shape stood in the field, in the same place where I had first noticed her. Her terrible gaze moved toward grandmother's peaceful face. Then her shoulders began to shake. A warm hand touched my cheek, and I jumped. It was Mother. She thought I was lost in grief. "Try not to worry," she whispered, wiping away tears I had not realized were falling. "She's at peace now. There's no more pain where she has gone." Father stood far from the coffin. His face was hard, and one fist was pressed against his mouth. No one approached him. We all knew he needed to grieve in his own way. Everyone else watched the coffin. I watched the banshee. Her swollen eyes met mine. Her mouth still hung open. Saliva mixed with the tears running down her chin. No one else saw her. No one else heard her. Only me. And as I stood beside grandmother's grave, one question began burning inside my mind. Grandmother had said the banshee's wail was a warning of death. She had also said that if you heard it, it was already too late to run. I had heard the wail. So did that mean grandmother had been the one marked for death? Or did it mean I was next? Story 2. Throughout my childhood and most of my teenage years, my family lived in a small town in upstate Pennsylvania. It was the kind of place where almost everyone knew each other, or at least recognized one another by face. There was one main road, a few small shops, a gas station, a diner that closed early, and rows of old houses that looked almost the same. The town itself was quiet, especially in the evenings. After sunset, the streets would become empty, and the only sounds were usually insects, distant dogs, and the occasional car passing through. Our house stood near the edge of town, far enough away from the main streets that it felt separated from everything else. It was a 2-story house with pale siding, dark windows, and a wide front porch that creaked whenever anyone stepped on it. Behind the house was nothing but forest. Thick trees stretched in every direction, growing so close together that even during the day, sunlight had trouble reaching the ground. Living that far from town did not bother me much. The only real problem was that the school bus could not reach our house. There were no proper paved roads leading to it, so every morning I had to walk about 10 minutes to the nearest bus stop. In the afternoon, I made the same walk back home. The houses around the edge of town were connected by long dirt paths. These paths split away from the main roads and disappeared into the woods. Some of them stretched for 20 or 30 minutes before reaching a house. During dry weather, the ground was dusty and hard. After rain, the paths became soft and muddy, with deep footprints and puddles that stayed for days. A lot of people in town thought those trails were creepy. My classmates sometimes asked how I could walk through the forest alone every day. They talked about wild animals, strangers hiding in the trees, and old stories about people getting lost in the woods. I never took those stories seriously. For me, the trail was peaceful. I knew every curve, every tree, every fallen branch, and every place where the ground became uneven. I knew where birds usually nested and where squirrels crossed the path. I knew which trees looked frightening at night and which ones made strange sounds in the wind. After years of walking there, the trail felt almost like a part of my home. Sometimes, after a difficult day at school, I actually looked forward to that walk. The silence gave me time to think. The air smelled clean, and the trees blocked out the noise of town. I often walked slowly, dragging my shoes through the dirt, listening to leaves move above me. Nothing truly frightening had ever happened there, at least not until one evening during summer. That year, I had joined a summer program that was something between a camp and an after-school activity. It was held in a community building near the center of town. We played sports, worked on small projects, and sometimes went on short trips. Most days, the program ended in the late afternoon, and I would walk from the building to the bus stop, then take the usual trail home. That particular day had been completely normal. The weather was warm, and the sky was clear. I remember being tired from running around outside for most of the day. My shirt was damp with sweat, and my backpack felt heavier than usual. All I wanted was to get home, eat something, and sit in front of the television. When the bus dropped me off, I waved goodbye to the driver and started walking. The first part of the journey was along the edge of a paved road. After about 10 minutes, I reached the turn that led into the forest. It was easy to recognize. A group of large trees stood near the entrance, and the dirt path began between them. Visually, everything looked normal. The trees were in the same places. The path had the same narrow shape. Even the broken branch that hung over the entrance was still there. But the moment I stepped onto the trail, I noticed the smell. At first, I thought a skunk had sprayed somewhere nearby. The odor hung in the air, thick and sharp. It was strong enough to make me stop walking for a moment. Strange smells were not unusual in the woods. I had come across dead animals before. Sometimes a deer, rabbit, or raccoon would die near the trail, and the smell of decay would spread through the area. It was disgusting, but it usually passed quickly. Once you walked far enough from the carcass, the air became normal again. This smell was different. It reminded me of spoiled eggs mixed with cheap laundry detergent. There was something sour beneath it, too. Something warm and rotten. It seemed to cover the entire trail. I pulled the front of my shirt over my nose and continued walking. After a few minutes, the smell still had not faded. If anything, it seemed stronger. I looked into the trees as I walked, trying to find the source. The forest was quiet. Too quiet, now that I think about it. There were no birds calling and no insects buzzing near my ears. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Still, I kept moving. I told myself that there was probably a dead animal hidden somewhere deeper in the woods. Maybe the wind had carried the smell along the trail. There had to be a simple explanation. But the longer I walked, the stranger everything felt. The trail seemed longer than I remembered. Normally, there was a large tree beside the path with a red arrow painted on its trunk. My old friend and I had painted that arrow a year earlier. It pointed left toward a smaller trail where we had built a treehouse. Whenever I saw the arrow, I knew I had about 10 or 15 minutes left before reaching home. That afternoon, I found the arrow at the usual spot. I remember feeling relieved when I saw it. The red paint was faded, but still visible. It pointed left just as it always had. I walked past it and continued toward home. 10 minutes passed, then 15, then 20. There was still no clearing. The trail should have ended by then. Beyond the last section of trees, there was supposed to be a wide open area with our house standing in the middle. I should have been able to see the roof through the branches, but there was nothing ahead of me except more dirt, more trees, and more shadow. I stopped walking and looked behind me. The red arrow was gone from sight. For the first time, Real fear began to rise inside me. I wondered if I had somehow taken the wrong path, though that seemed impossible. There were no turns after the arrow. The trail went straight until it reached our house. I decided to walk back. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe there was another small path I had accidentally stepped onto without noticing. I turned around and took only a few steps. The red arrow was suddenly right in front of me. I froze. It was the same tree, the same faded paint, the same rough bark. I stared at it for several seconds. Confused, I had walked for at least 20 minutes beyond that point. There was no possible way I could have returned after only a few steps. I looked around, trying to understand what had happened. The trees seemed normal. The path behind me stretched into the distance. The path ahead of me looked exactly the same. I turned around again and started walking toward home. This time I counted my steps. 100, 200, 300. I walked for nearly 15 minutes. Nothing changed. The trail continued forever. My breathing became heavier, and the smell grew worse. It filled my nose and throat. I could almost taste it. I turned around once more. After 3 steps, I was back at the arrow. That was when I knew something was terribly wrong. I tried again. I walked forward for 10 minutes, then turned back. A few steps later, the arrow appeared. I tried running. I ran until my chest hurt and my legs burned. I must have covered a huge distance. When I looked behind me and walked back, the arrow returned almost immediately. I did this over and over, 7 times, maybe more. No matter how far I went, the trail always brought me back to the same tree. Panic began to take control of me. I shouted for my parents. I called for help. My voice echoed weakly through the forest, but no one answered. The silence afterward was worse. Then I remembered the smaller trail. The arrow pointed toward the treehouse my friend and I had built the previous summer. We had made it from old boards, broken pieces of fencing, and anything else we could carry into the woods. It was not really a house. It was more like a platform raised a few feet above the ground, with one wooden wall and a short ladder. Still, it was somewhere familiar. I stepped off the main path and followed the direction of the arrow. Almost immediately, the smell began to fade. With every step, the air became cleaner. By the time I reached the treehouse, the odor had vanished completely. I stood there for a while, breathing deeply. The treehouse looked exactly as I remembered it. The boards were crooked. The ladder leaned slightly to one side. One corner of the platform was lower than the others because we had never fixed it properly. Seeing it calmed me. I climbed the 3-foot ladder and pulled myself onto the platform. The wood creaked beneath my weight. The whole structure shook slightly, just as it always had. I sat against the single wooden wall and tried to calm down. For a few minutes, I almost convinced myself that I had imagined everything. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe the heat had confused me. Maybe I had been walking in circles without realizing it. But even while I tried to make excuses, a quiet feeling inside me said something was wrong. The treehouse looked the same, but it did not feel like the one I had built. The wood felt colder than it should have. The air around it seemed still. I could not hear any birds or animals nearby. Even the normal creaking sounded wrong, as if it was coming from somewhere below the platform instead of from the boards beneath me. I touched the wall behind me. It was damp. I quickly pulled my hand away. The sky above the trees was changing. The bright afternoon light had begun to turn orange. Sunset was approaching. I could not stay there. My parents would already be wondering where I was. I climbed down carefully and started walking back toward the main trail. As I moved through the trees, the uneasy feeling returned. At first, it was only a small thought. Then it became a certainty. I was not alone. I could hear footsteps behind me. They were quiet, almost hidden beneath the sound of my own shoes. When I walked, it sounded as if another pair of feet moved at the same time. I stopped. For a split second, I heard another step behind me. Then silence. I stood perfectly still. My heart beat so hard that I could hear it in my ears. After a while, I started walking again, slowly this time. Step, step, step. There it was. Another rhythm beneath mine, not quite matching, just slightly delayed. I stopped again. The second pair of footsteps stopped too. I turned around quickly. No one was there, only trees and shadows. I forced myself to continue. The closer I came to the main trail, the stronger the rotten smell became. It returned slowly at first, then hit me all at once. I covered my mouth and nose. When I reached the red arrow, darkness had started spreading through the woods. I turned toward home and ran. Once again, the trail stretched endlessly. After several minutes, I turned back. 3 steps later, I was at the arrow. I screamed in frustration and fear. I tried the treehouse path again. I passed the treehouse and kept going deeper into the woods, hoping it might lead somewhere else. But after walking for several minutes, I somehow found myself back at the same platform. It did not matter which direction I chose. The forest kept returning me to the same places. The red arrow, the treehouse, the endless trail. The light continued to fade. Soon, the sky above the trees became dark blue, then black. The moon was visible through small openings in the branches, but its light barely reached the ground. The smell became unbearable. It made my eyes water. I gagged several times and had to pinch my nose while breathing through my mouth. Even then, the taste of it remained on my tongue. I began to understand something. Whatever was trapping me on the main trail did not seem to understand what was beyond the treehouse. The smaller path behaved differently. The smell vanished there. The endless loop changed. It was almost as if the thing controlling the trail could not fully reach that area. That thought gave me a small amount of hope. I returned to the red arrow and stood there thinking. Then I tried walking backward. I faced the direction of home, but moved away from it. After a few steps, the arrow appeared in front of me again. I turned around and looked back toward the place where I had first entered the trail. Maybe the path behind me would lead back to the main road. I ran in that direction. The trail stretched farther than it should have, just as the path toward home had. Still, I did not stop. I ran for what felt like 7 or 8 minutes. My lungs burned, my legs felt weak, and my backpack slammed against my shoulders with every step. Finally, I stopped to catch my breath. I bent forward, placing my hands on my knees. The forest around me was completely dark. I listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, I heard a wet sound somewhere behind me. I slowly raised my head and turned. Something stood in the middle of the trail. It was far enough away that I could not see its face, but close enough for me to understand that it was not human. It was tall, much taller than any person I had ever seen. Its body was narrow, but its arms hung low, almost reaching its knees. Moonlight touched part of its skin, making it shine. The surface looked wet or slimy, as if it had just crawled out of deep water. It stood completely still. I could not see any clothes. I could not see its eyes. But I knew it was looking at me. My entire body went cold. The creature made a low sound. It was not a growl. It sounded like someone trying to speak while choking underwater. A deep, wet gurgle rolled through the trees. I took one step back. The creature leaned forward. I turned and ran. Behind me, I heard it begin to move. The sound of its sprinting was unlike anything I had ever heard. Its feet hit the dirt with heavy, wet slaps. Its movements sounded forceful and unnatural, as if its joints did not bend the right way. I did not look back. I could not. Every part of my body told me that if I saw it clearly, I would lose control and freeze. I ran harder than I had ever run in my life. Branches scratched my arms. Stones cut through the thin soles of my shoes. My chest hurt so badly that I thought I might collapse. The footsteps came closer. Whatever it was gaining on me. I began to cry. Tears blurred my vision as I stumbled through the darkness. I kept thinking about my house. I thought about my mother waiting for me. I thought about the warm kitchen light, the sound of the television, and the safety of my bedroom. I just wanted to go home. The creature was almost behind me now. I could hear its wet breathing. I tried to move faster, but my legs were failing. Then something grabbed me. A powerful force yanked me backward. I screamed as my feet left the ground. My backpack pulled against my shoulders, and I fell hard onto the dirt. Pain shot through my back. I covered my face with both arms and closed my eyes. I expected claws, teeth, cold hands. Anything. Instead, I heard a voice. Oh, God. Oh, my God, it's him. I knew that voice. It was my mother. Hands grabbed my arms and pulled me up. I opened my eyes. She was standing over me. Behind her, I could see the shape of our house. The porch light was on, and warm yellow light shone through the windows. I had made it home. My mother wrapped her arms around me. I began sobbing against her shoulder. The hug felt slightly cold, but I did not care. It was her. After hours of walking through that impossible forest, I was finally safe. She held me tightly while I cried. It's been 5 hours, she said. Where were you? I don't know, I replied. My voice shook badly. I was walking home, and then I guess I got lost. Don't ever do that to me again, she whispered. Please, I won't, I said. I promise. I leaned my head against her shoulder. For the first time since entering the trail, I felt my body begin to relax. My breathing slowed. The house stood only a short distance away. Everything was going to be okay. Then my mother spoke again. I still have some leftovers from dinner, she said softly. Uncle Joey saved them for you. I stopped breathing. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood her. What? Uncle Joey saved them for you, she repeated. I slowly lifted my head. I don't have an Uncle Joey. The words came out quietly. My mother did not move. I don't have an Uncle Joey, I said again. I don't. Before I could finish, the smell returned. It was stronger than ever. Spoiled eggs, cheap detergent, rotting flesh. The odor surrounded me, filling my lungs. My heart sank. The arms around me no longer felt comforting. They felt cold, unnaturally cold. The body holding me seemed too tall, and the shoulder beneath my face felt hard and narrow. I tried to pull away. The arms tightened. Fingers pressed into my back. They were too long, far too long. I could feel them digging through my shirt. The silence between us became unbearable. No insects. No wind, no sound from the house. I looked toward the windows. The warm light inside did not move. There were no shadows, no voices, nothing. My back suddenly felt wet. A thick, cold liquid spread across my shirt where the fingers touched me. The same slimy feeling I had seen shining on the creature's skin beneath the moonlight. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The thing still wore my mother's face. It smiled down at me, but the smile was too wide, and as the smell grew stronger, I understood the truth. I had never escaped the trail. It had only learned how to make me stop running. Story 3. I have been afraid of being alone for as long as I can remember. The fear did not begin after some terrible event. There was no single night when I woke up and discovered that everyone had disappeared. No one locked me inside a dark room or left me behind in a crowded place. The fear was simply there from the beginning, buried deep inside me before I was old enough to understand it. As my memories became clearer, so did its presence. It was always waiting at the back of my mind. Sometimes it felt like a pair of cold hands resting on my shoulders. Other times, it felt like a frozen palm pressed against the back of my neck, reminding me that it had never gone away. It could make my body stiff and my breathing shallow. Even when I was surrounded by people, I could feel it standing beside me like an invisible companion. When I was in kindergarten, my parents arranged a birthday party for me. I still remember the bright paper decorations, the colorful balloons, and the faces of the other children gathered around the table. They laughed while my mother carried in a cake covered in white frosting. 5 candles burned on top of it. Everyone began singing. I looked around at the smiling children and tried to smile with them. Their faces were familiar. Some were my friends. Others were children I saw every day at school. My parents stood nearby, watching me with pride. The room was full of noise, warmth, and life. Yet I could feel the coldness inside me. When the song ended, my mother told me to make a wish. The other children leaned closer, waiting for me to blow out the candles. Most children that age would have wished for toys, candy, or something impossible. They might have wished to fly among the stars or own a castle in the clouds. I wished for the moment to never end. I wanted the room to remain exactly as it was. I wanted everyone to stay in their places, smiling at me forever. I wanted the candles to keep burning until my mind disappeared and I no longer understood the passing of time. I believed that if the moment ended, everyone would eventually leave. And if everyone left, I might discover that they had never truly been there at all. That fear followed me through childhood and into my teenage years. It followed me into crowded school hallways, family dinners, holiday gatherings, and noisy parties. No matter how many people stood around me, part of me remained convinced that I was alone. Years later, I stood in the middle of a concert crowd while my favorite band played on stage. Thousands of people screamed around me. The music was so loud that the bass seemed to move through my bones. I could feel it beating in my chest like a second heart. People pushed against me from every direction. Their arms rose into the air. Their voices joined together as they sang every word. I should have felt connected to them. Instead, I blinked. For one terrible second, the crowd seemed to disappear. The lights still flashed. The music continued. The stage remained in front of me. But the people around me felt distant and unreal, like shadows pretending to be human. Their voices became muffled, and the space between us seemed endless. Then I blinked again, and everything returned. The crowd shouted. Someone bumped into my shoulder. A stranger beside me smiled and continued singing, but the cold feeling stayed. It had been there since birth, and I was beginning to believe that it would remain until death. When I finally asked for professional help, I was told that I might have autophobia, the fear of being alone. The explanation sounded simple enough, but it was not correct. I was not afraid of being physically abandoned. People had left me many times, and I had survived each departure. Friends had stopped calling. Lovers had promised devotion and then disappeared. Family members had chosen their own lives over mine. Coworkers had acted loyal until loyalty became inconvenient. Human beings were not made for trust. I had learned that lesson again and again. Promises were only words people used when they wanted something. Love was usually temporary. Devotion lasted only until a better opportunity appeared. I was not afraid that someone might leave me. I expected people to leave. What frightened me was something much worse. I feared that during the loudest and happiest moments of my life, I would look away for 1 second and realize that I had always been alone. The fear was not an invader. It was not some disease that had entered my mind. It was my oldest companion. On my 27th birthday, I sat in a busy restaurant, surrounded by coworkers, friends, and family. The tables had been pushed together so everyone could sit close. Wrapped gifts were stacked near my chair. Some were expensive, while others had clearly been chosen with care. In front of me was a large cake, decorated so perfectly that it looked artificial. Smooth frosting covered the surface, and thin lines of dark chocolate formed careful patterns around the edges. 2 candles stood in the center, one shaped like the number 2 and the other like the number 7. Everyone seemed happy. Glasses touched as people made toasts. Someone told an embarrassing story about me from work. My cousin laughed so loudly that several people at the next table turned to look at us. My mother kept taking photographs, asking us to move closer together each time. I looked down at my polished leather loafers while they prepared to sing. For a moment, I wondered what wish I should make. A safe wish would have been something ordinary. I could have wished for money, success, health, or another year surrounded by the people at that table. But wishes had never helped me before. I was tired of asking the universe to save me. When the song ended, everyone cheered and told me to blow out the candles. I leaned forward and watched the small flames bend in the air. Then I made a decision. I would no longer wait for the fear to leave. I would find the silent observer that had followed me throughout my life. I would turn around and face it. I would hunt the thing that had hunted me since childhood. I blew out the candles. The room filled with applause. "Happy birthday," everyone said. I laughed quietly, but no one understood why. Later that night, after the dinner ended, I slipped the number candles into my coat pocket. I did not know why I took them. Perhaps I wanted proof that the evening had happened. Perhaps I already knew I would need them. I said goodbye to everyone outside the restaurant. There were hugs, promises to meet again, and repeated reminders to call when I reached home. Then they walked away. Within minutes, I was alone on the street. The city looked different after midnight. Shops had closed, and their dark windows reflected the empty road. A thin layer of rainwater covered the pavement. Streetlights glowed above the puddles, making the ground shine like broken glass. I walked without a clear destination. My footsteps sounded hollow. The cold presence followed closely, pulling at me with every movement. I could almost feel its fingers tightening around my shoulders. It wanted me to remember that the birthday celebration had ended. The laughter was gone. The gifts were no longer around me. Everyone had returned to their own homes and their own private lives. No one was thinking about me now. I stopped beside a puddle and looked down at my reflection. The face staring back at me did not seem human. The moving water stretched my mouth into a twisted smile. My eyes looked too large, curious but calculating. The reflection appeared to understand something I had not yet admitted. It knew that all the love I had received would never be enough. People had held me, praised me, kissed me, and promised to stay. None of it had filled the empty space inside me. Their love could not reach the deepest part of my mind. Perhaps nothing could. I turned away from the puddle and continued walking. Warm streetlights disappeared behind me as I entered a narrow alley where darkness gathered between the buildings. The shadows seemed to fold into each other, hiding forgotten corners filled with rubbish, broken boxes, and rainwater. That was where I saw them. They sat quietly against the wall with their knees pulled close to their chest. Their clothes were dark and worn. Their head was lowered, but I could tell they were awake. There was something still and watchful about them, like a frightened animal trying not to attract attention. I stopped several feet away. They slowly raised their head. Our eyes met. For a moment, neither of us moved. Something passed between us in that silence. It felt like recognition, as though two travelers had finally found each other after wandering through the same cold land for years. They looked lost. I knew what it meant to be lost. "Why are you here?" I asked. My voice sounded too loud in the alley. A question like that could have caused anger. They could have told me to leave. They could have shouted for help or run away. Instead, they continued looking at me. "Take me to where I need to be," they said. Their voice was calm, but there was no hope in it. The words seemed to change the air around us. The distant sound of traffic faded. Even the rain appeared to pause. I wondered whether this was the confrontation I had been seeking my entire life. Perhaps the person sitting before me was not a stranger at all. Perhaps they were the physical form of the companion that had haunted me since childhood. Perhaps fate had finally given it a face. I extended my hand. It was not an act of kindness or friendship. It was an act of desperation. They looked at my hand for only a second before taking it. Their skin was cold. When they stood, I felt something inside me shift. My journey had begun. I say my journey because I already knew that their journey was almost over. The choice of words matters. I had plans for myself, but I saw no future in their eyes. What purpose did a lost soul have if it no longer wanted anything? They showed no ambition, hunger, or desire. They moved like someone who had already accepted the end. That was the difference between us. I was empty, but I still wanted something. I wanted permanence. We walked through the city together. The night air tightened around us like a thin sheet, barely hiding the terrible ending waiting ahead. I led them away from the busier streets and deeper into a maze of narrow roads. Fog curled over the cracked pavement. Many of the streetlights were broken. The few that still worked flickered above us, turning our shadows into long, shaking shapes. Their footsteps matched mine. They did not walk slowly or try to escape. They simply followed, neither certain nor afraid. The sound of their shoes against the road was like a weak heartbeat struggling to keep its rhythm. Several times I looked at them from the corner of my eye. Their face was calm. Their expression reminded me of an old dog that somehow understands its life is nearly finished. There was no panic in their eyes, only quiet surrender. I wondered what had happened to them. Had someone abandoned them? Had they lost their home, their family, or their reason for living? For a moment, I almost asked. Then I decided it did not matter. Knowing their story might have made them too real. It might have turned them into a person instead of an answer. We eventually reached an abandoned courtyard behind several empty buildings. The place had once belonged to a small factory, but the windows were broken and the doors had been locked for years. Concrete tiles covered the ground, cracked by weeds and age. No one came there at night. No one would hear us. "We're here," I said. My voice held no warmth. It sounded distant, as though another person had spoken through me. They looked around, but did not ask where we were. They did not demand an explanation. They simply stood beneath the pale light of the moon. The weight of everything that had led me there pressed down on me. Every birthday, every goodbye, and every moment of loneliness seemed to gather around us. I remembered how people had left one by one. I remembered reaching for comfort and feeling it slip through my fingers. The stars looked down from far above. They seemed cold but understanding, as though they knew my wish was finally going to come true. Something greater than either of us moved through that moment. People often speak about fate as if it is a force that controls our lives. I no longer believed that. Fate was only a reminder that we had not yet done enough to take control. I had spent 27 years as the hunted. Now I would become the hunter. No, I would become the executioner. You may not understand what happened next. You may want to separate yourself from me. You may tell yourself that you would have turned around, walked away, and allowed the stranger to continue living. But you are reading this. You followed me from the restaurant into the wet streets. You watched me enter the alley. You saw me take their hand and lead them here. You continued even when you understood what I planned to do. That makes you a witness. Perhaps it makes you something more. Their back was turned to me. I stepped closer and held them against my chest. My heart beat so violently that I was certain they could feel it. Life moved through the empty shell I called my body. The invisible companion that had followed me since childhood seemed to loosen its grip. For the first time, the cold fingers around my neck began to pull away. It understood how far I was willing to go. I wish I could say that I gave the stranger one final chance to leave. I wish I could say that I whispered a warning or opened my arms and allowed them to run. But I did not. If I let them go, nothing would change. I would return to the same cold rooms, the same temporary friendships, and the same cruel truth that everyone eventually leaves. In that moment, I understood something. Love was not a gift. Love was a claim. People said they loved one another, yet they still allowed each other to walk away. They accepted distance, change, and death as if separation were natural. I could not accept it. I told myself that what I did was an act of mercy. Mercy for their pain. Mercy for the hopeless look in their eyes. Mercy for whatever suffering had led them to sit alone in that alley. But I did not know whether they needed mercy. Perhaps the mercy was for me. The act itself passed like a broken memory. I will not describe every movement. I remember the struggle being smaller than I expected. I remember their body becoming heavy in my arms. I remember the silence afterward. Their face turned pale and still. Their eyes remained partly open, but whatever had lived behind them was gone. For a moment, I wondered whether I had freed them. The thought did not remain long. It slipped away and became trapped inside the web I had built around us. Their blood was warm and sticky. It ran over my hands and between my fingers. I tried to catch it, cupping my palms beneath the wound as though I could stop each drop from touching the cold concrete. I did not want any part of them to escape. Then I began to cry. The tears came so suddenly that I could barely breathe. I held their lifeless body closer and cried harder than I had ever cried before. I did not understand the emotion. Was it sadness? Was it grief? Was it guilt? Or was it the satisfaction of a deep hunger that had finally been fed after years of waiting? Their body remained pressed against mine. At first, I could still feel warmth through their clothes. Slowly, that warmth began to fade. The fear that had tortured me throughout my life seemed to understand what I had done. It no longer stood behind me. It no longer pressed its cold hand against my neck. It watched silently. "I love you," I told the stranger. The words sounded strange in the empty courtyard. I reached into my coat pocket and found the candles from my birthday cake. The number 2 and the number 7 had lost their bright color. The wax was scratched, and the small wicks were black from the flames I had blown out earlier. I placed the candles in their limp hands. The sight of those numbers resting against their pale fingers filled me with a feeling I could not control. I began to laugh. The sound came from somewhere deep inside me, from a place I had never known existed. It grew louder until it echoed between the abandoned buildings. 27 years. That was how long I had waited to defeat the fear. The stranger's death had frozen the moment in time. They could never abandon me now. They could never make a promise and break it. They could never grow bored, fall in love with someone else, or decide I was no longer important. Their silence was permanent. Some people would call what I had done cruel. They would say I had taken a life for selfish reasons. They would say the stranger had never agreed to become part of me. But I saw it differently. To me, it was the greatest act of love I had ever performed for myself. It was a sacrifice made in the name of happiness. It was the final agreement between two silent strangers who had met at the right place and found the only ending that made sense. At least that was what I told myself. The truth was simpler. It was not love. It was a cage. I had not saved them from loneliness. I had trapped them inside mine. I held their body as it grew colder. Their final breath had already escaped, but I imagined I could still feel it against my skin. The city continued moving beyond the courtyard. Cars crossed distant roads. People slept in warm beds. Somewhere, music played inside a late-night bar. Somewhere else, a child cried, and a tired parent lifted them into loving arms. But inside that courtyard, time had stopped. I finally had what I had wished for since childhood. An unbroken presence. A person who could never leave. For the first time in my life, I believed I would never be alone. Still, I leaned close to their ear and whispered the words again. "I love you." They did not answer. "I love you." Their body remained still. "I love you." This time, I meant it forever. Story 4. I got the security cameras for my 40th birthday. My wife, Sarah, thought it was one of the worst gifts I had ever bought for myself. Technically, she had given me the money and told me to choose something I wanted, so I ordered the cameras online. When the boxes arrived, she stared at them as if I had wasted our savings on a pile of useless plastic. She told me, We lived in a safe neighborhood. She reminded me that nothing serious had happened on our street in the 9 years we had lived there. No break-ins, no stolen cars, no strangers looking through windows. The worst crime anyone could remember was when someone took a bicycle from an unlocked garage 3 streets away. She said I was being paranoid. She was probably right. Still, I installed the cameras. There were 3 of them. One covered the front door and most of the porch. Another watched the driveway, including both of our cars and part of the street. The third camera pointed across the backyard. From that angle, it showed almost everything behind the house. Our yard was not large, but it was deep. We had wooden fences on both sides, a patch of grass in the middle, and a small shed in the back left corner. Behind the rear fence was a thick stretch of woods that continued for several miles. There were no walking trails back there, and the ground became muddy whenever it rained. Most people in the neighborhood avoided the woods because there was no real reason to go inside them. Installing the cameras took me most of the weekend. Sarah watched me climb ladders, drill holes, and pull wires through the walls. Every few minutes, she asked whether all that work was really necessary. I told her it would give us peace of mind. She laughed and said the cameras were more likely to take away my peace than give me any. At first, nothing unusual happened. Each morning, I checked the recordings while drinking coffee at the kitchen table. I would watch the front porch, then the driveway, and finally, the backyard. Most nights, the cameras recorded nothing except moths, rain, moving branches, and the occasional neighborhood cat. It quickly became part of my daily routine. Wake up, make coffee, sit at the table, check the footage. I did it without thinking. I barely paid attention most mornings. I would speed through hours of video in a few minutes, looking only at the moments marked by the motion sensors. Then, on the 12th morning after installing the cameras, I noticed the figure. The backyard camera had recorded movement at exactly 3:11 in the morning. I expected to see a raccoon or a cat near the shed. Instead, there was something tall and dark standing beside it. At first, I thought it was a shadow. I paused the video and leaned closer to the laptop screen. The shape was taller than any person I knew. It was extremely thin, with long arms hanging close to its sides. The night vision made everything look gray, but the figure appeared darker than the trees, the fence, and the shed around it. It was not standing behind anything. It was clearly inside our yard. I zoomed in. The picture became rough and unclear, but the shape remained visible. It had a head, narrow shoulders, a long body, and 2 legs. I could not see any clothes. I could not see a face. There were no bright eyes reflecting the camera's infrared light. It simply stood there. I watched the recording for several minutes. The figure did not move. It did not shift its weight. It did not turn its head. It did not raise its arms. It was so still that I began wondering whether someone had placed a strange statue beside the shed as a joke. I switched from the recording to the live camera. It was almost 7 in the morning by then. The sun had already started rising, and the yard was empty. I put down my coffee and went outside. There was nothing beside the shed. No statue, no person, no footprints in the damp grass. The gate was locked from the inside, and the fence did not appear damaged. I walked around the shed twice. I checked behind it and even looked inside, although I knew the door had been locked all night. Nothing was there. When I returned to the kitchen, I played the recording again. The figure was still visible. I watched until 4:03 in the morning. At 4:02, it was standing near the shed. At 4:03, It was gone. There was no movement between those moments. It did not walk away. It did not climb over the fence. It did not enter the shed. It simply disappeared between two frames. 1 second, it was there. The next second, it was not. I told myself the camera had glitched. Maybe two different images had overlapped. Maybe a branch had cast a strange shadow. Maybe the night vision had created the shape. Then I checked the footage from the previous night. At 3:11 in the morning, the same figure appeared beside the shed. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. I checked another night. It was there again. I went back through the entire week. Every night, at exactly 3:11, the figure appeared near the shed. It remained there until exactly 4:03. Then it disappeared. The times never changed. The place never changed. The figure stood in the same part of the yard, facing the same direction. It was not facing our house. It was facing the rear fence and the woods beyond it. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. I thought about waking Sarah, but I knew what she would say. She would tell me it was a camera problem. She would remind me that I had become too interested in the recordings. She might even make me take the cameras down. So I did not tell her. Instead, I spent the next day searching online for explanations. I read about insects appearing large when they crawled close to a lens. I read about infrared reflections, camera delays, and image ghosting. None of the examples looked like the figure in my yard. That night, I stayed awake. Sarah went to bed around 11. I told her I had work to finish and remained in the living room with my laptop. I turned off the lights so I could see the screen clearly. At 3:10, the yard was empty. The grass moved slightly in the wind. The shed sat in darkness. The fence looked pale under the night vision. The clock changed to 3:11. The figure was suddenly there. I did not see it arrive. One moment, the space beside the shed was empty. The next moment, the dark shape was standing there. My hands became cold. I watched it for nearly an hour. It did not move. At 4:03, it vanished. After that night, I started staying awake regularly. I told Sarah I was having trouble sleeping. She suggested that I stop drinking coffee in the evening. I agreed, but the coffee was not the reason I was awake. Every night I watched the backyard. Every night, the figure appeared. I began noticing details I had missed before. It always faced the same section of fence. Its head was slightly lowered, as if it were watching something close to the ground on the other side. Its arms were much longer than normal human arms. Its hands seemed to reach almost to its knees. Sometimes the wind moved the trees, but the figure remained completely still. Rain fell on it without making it react. Once, a raccoon entered the yard and walked within a few feet of the shape. The animal suddenly froze, stared toward the shed, and then ran away so quickly that it crashed into the fence before finding the gap beneath the gate. The figure did not respond. I checked the front camera and the driveway camera, hoping one of them might show how it entered the property. They showed nothing. At 3:10, the backyard was empty. At 3:11, the figure appeared. The other cameras never recorded anyone walking around the house. No one came through the gate. No one crossed the driveway. No one approached from the street. The figure only existed in the backyard. After several nights, I finally spoke to our neighbor, Miss Harris. He had lived next door for more than 20 years and knew almost everyone in the area. I found him trimming a bush near his front porch. I asked whether he had ever seen anyone walking through the woods behind our homes at night. He stopped cutting. For a moment, he did not answer. Then he smiled, but it was not a natural smile. He said the woods had always been quiet. He told me children sometimes played near the edge during the day, but no sensible person went deep inside. I asked if he had ever noticed anything standing near our fence. His eyes moved toward my backyard. No, he said quickly. Nothing unusual. The way he answered made me think he was lying. I asked him again. This time, his smile disappeared. He told me I should stop looking into the woods. Then he seemed to realize what he had said and quickly corrected himself. I mean, there's nothing worth seeing back there, he said. Before I could ask another question, he picked up his tools and went inside. That evening, I asked Sarah whether she had ever noticed anything strange in the backyard at night. She stared at me for a few seconds. Then she sighed. She said I was spending too much time watching the cameras. She said the whole reason she had disliked them was because she knew I would become obsessed. I asked whether she had ever heard noises near the shed. Her expression changed, only for a moment. She looked toward the kitchen window, which faced the backyard. Then she told me to relax and stop trying to frighten myself. There was something in her voice that made me stop asking questions. But I did not stop watching. I began keeping notes. I wrote down the date, the time the figure appeared, the time it disappeared, the weather, and anything unusual about its position. For the first 22 nights, nothing changed. Then, on the 23rd night, the figure appeared about a foot closer to the fence. I compared the recording with the previous night. I measured the distance using a crack in the shed wall as a reference. There was no doubt. It had moved. On night 27, its head was tilted to one side. It looked like it was listening. The pose made me more uncomfortable than its stillness had. Until then, I could pretend it was an object or a problem with the camera. Objects did not listen. On night 31, both of its arms were raised. They stretched toward the woods beyond the fence. Its fingers were open and extended, as though it were reaching for something it could not quite touch. That was the first night I woke Sarah. I carried the laptop into the bedroom and placed it in front of her. By the time she sat up, the figure had returned its arms to its sides. She stared at the screen. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she told me she could not see anything. I pointed directly at the dark shape beside the shed. She shook her head. There's nothing there, she said. I thought she was joking. I moved the laptop closer to her. The figure was clear. It stood out against the pale fence. Sarah looked directly at it and repeated that the yard was empty. Her voice had become quiet. I asked whether she truly could not see it. She became angry and told me to leave her alone. Then she pulled the blanket over her shoulder and turned away. I returned to the living room. I could not decide which possibility frightened me more. Either she could not see the figure, or she could see it and was pretending she could not. On night 39, the figure stood directly against the rear fence. Its face, if it had one, was only inches from the wooden boards. It remained there until 4:03. The next afternoon, I decided to enter the woods. I told Sarah I was going for a walk. She did not ask where. I climbed over the rear fence because there was no gate leading into the trees. The ground on the other side was covered with dead leaves and wet branches. Almost immediately, I noticed the silence. There were no birds, no insects, no squirrels moving through the leaves. The neighborhood was close behind me, but after only a few minutes, I could no longer hear cars or lawnmowers. Even the wind seemed weaker beneath the trees. I walked in the direction the figure had been facing. The woods became thicker. Branches caught on my jacket. The ground sloped downward, and the daylight seemed to fade even though it was early afternoon. After about 15 minutes, I found a circle where no trees grew. The ground inside it was dark and bare. In the center stood a narrow wooden post. It looked old and partly burned. Strange marks had been cut into its surface, but mud and age made them difficult to understand. I did not touch it. As I stood there, I heard something moving deeper in the woods. It sounded like slow footsteps. One step, then silence. Another step, then silence again. The sound was coming closer. I turned and walked back toward the house. After a few seconds, I started running. I did not look behind me. When I reached the fence, I climbed over so quickly that I tore my jeans and cut my hand on a nail. Sarah was standing at the kitchen window, watching me. She did not ask why I was running. She did not ask why my hand was bleeding. She simply closed the curtain. I never entered the woods again. The figure continued to appear every night. Its posture changed more often after my walk. Sometimes it leaned toward the fence. Sometimes it crouched low, with its arms hanging near the ground. Once, it pressed both hands against the wooden boards. Still, it never looked toward the house. That detail became strangely comforting. Whatever the figure was, it did not seem interested in us. It was watching the woods. Maybe it was keeping something away. That thought entered my mind one night and refused to leave. I had always believed the figure was the danger. But what if it was guarding the fence? What if it stood in our yard every night because something on the other side wanted to come through? I began studying the footage differently. I no longer watched only the figure. I watched the trees behind it. Sometimes branches moved when there was no wind. Sometimes a dark shape passed between the trunks. Once, at 3:56, two pale points appeared far back in the woods. They looked almost like eyes. The figure raised one arm. The pale points disappeared. I barely slept after that. Then, last night, everything changed. I checked the live feed shortly after 3:11. The backyard was empty. At first, I felt confused. Then relief rushed through me. The figure had not appeared. I watched until 3:30. Nothing. I checked the earlier recording to make sure I had not missed it. The figure had appeared at 3:11 as usual. It stood at the fence until 3:41. Then, for the first time in all the footage I had watched, it turned around. The movement was slow. Its head turned first. Then, its shoulders. Then, the rest of its body. It faced the house. Even through the rough night vision image, I felt certain it was looking directly at the camera. No face was visible, but I could feel its attention. It stood that way for 1 second. Then it disappeared. It did not return. I stayed awake until sunrise, watching the empty yard. I should have been relieved. For weeks, something impossible had been standing behind my home. Now it was gone, but I could not stop thinking about the way it had turned. It had not looked angry. It had not looked curious. It had looked afraid. That morning, I reviewed every recording from the previous weeks. I noticed something I should have understood much earlier. The figure had never once looked at our house. Not when the porch light turned on. Not when Sarah opened the back door to let the dog outside. Not even on the night when I had gone into the yard. That had happened around the second week. I had been tired and frightened, but I had also been angry. At 3:20, I opened the back door, and walked toward the shed. The figure stood 20 feet away from me. I shouted at it. I demanded to know who it was. It did not react. I moved closer. It remained focused on the woods. At the time, I believed it was ignoring me. Now, I understood that it had been too concerned with something else to care that I was there. Whatever it had been watching was not inside our yard. Not yet. I spent the day telling myself that the figure's disappearance was good news. Maybe it had completed whatever strange task brought it there. Maybe it had moved on. Maybe the camera problem had fixed itself. That evening, I locked every door and window. Sarah watched me without speaking. Before bed, she asked whether the backyard was empty. It was the first time she had mentioned the camera without me bringing it up. I asked her why she wanted to know. She did not answer. She went upstairs and locked the bedroom door. I remained in the living room. At 3:11, the motion alert appeared on my laptop. My hands began shaking before I opened the feed. Something was standing near the shed. For one hopeful second, I thought the first figure had returned. Then I saw its position. The new shape stood exactly where the other one had first appeared weeks earlier, but it was facing the house. It was shorter and wider than the first creature. Its head seemed too large for its body. Its arms hung at uneven lengths, and its shoulders moved slightly as if it were breathing. It was not still like the other figure. It swayed from side to side. Its face was pointed directly toward the room where I sat. I turned off the lamp beside me. The figure's head moved. It followed the change in light. That was when I understood. The first creature was gone. Something else had taken its place, and this one was watching me. I rewound the recording to see when it had appeared. At 3:10, the yard was empty. At 3:11, it stood beside the shed. For 36 minutes, it did not move. Then, at 3:47, it took one step toward the house. The motion was awkward. Its knee bent in the wrong direction, but the rest of its body remained upright. At 3:48, it took another step. At 3:49, another. One step every minute. I kept watching. 3:50, another step. 3:51, another. It crossed the grass slowly, never looking away from the camera. At 3:58, it reached the middle of the yard. At 4:01, it was close enough that I could see the outline of its mouth. It looked like a long, dark opening stretching across most of its face. At 4:02, it moved beyond the area covered by the camera. The recording did not show it reach the house. At 4:03, the yard was empty. I checked the front door camera. Nothing. I checked the driveway. Nothing. I checked the side windows and the porch. There was no sign of it. I stood in the living room listening. The house was completely quiet. Then I heard a soft sound above me. 3 slow footsteps crossed the bedroom floor. I called Sarah's name. She did not answer. I reached for my phone, but before I could dial, the backyard camera sent another motion alert. I looked at the laptop. The shed was empty. The yard was empty. The fence stood undamaged. For a moment, I thought the alert had been caused by the wind. Then, the image darkened. Something was standing directly in front of the camera. It was so close that its body covered almost the entire screen. I could see only a dark shape and part of the pale wall behind it. The camera was mounted more than 9 feet above the ground. Whatever stood before it was tall enough to look straight into the lens. Its head tilted slowly. The dark opening on its face widened. It was not looking at the camera. It was looking through it, looking past the glass, looking at the screen, looking at me. And for the first time since I installed the cameras, what I was watching was not recorded footage. It was live. Story 5. I was 15 years old when this happened, and even though 10 years have passed, I still think about it almost every day. Some memories slowly fade as you get older. The small details disappear first, then the faces become unclear, and eventually the whole event feels more like a dream than something that truly happened. This memory has never faded. I can still picture the dark woods, the silver Coke can leaving my hand, and those pale white eyes staring back at me. I can still remember the feeling that moved through my body when I realized the fox was not going to run away. I grew up in a medium-sized town in the UK. It was not a tiny village where everyone knew each other, but it was not a large city either. It had rows of houses, small parks, local shops, a few schools, and narrow roads that became very quiet after dark. There were also several patches of woodland left between the neighborhoods. Most of them were not large enough to become lost in, but at night they could seem deeper and darker than they really were. We do not have wild raccoons or opossums wandering through gardens like people sometimes see in North America. What we do have are foxes. They live almost everywhere, even when people do not notice them. They hide beneath sheds, behind fences, near railway tracks, and inside overgrown pieces of land. Most of the time, you only see them late in the evening or early in the morning. They cross roads quickly, keeping low to the ground, then disappear through a hedge before you can get a proper look at them. I had always liked animals. I was not one of those people who knew every species or spent weekends watching wildlife, but I never wanted to hurt anything. If I saw a dog, I usually wanted to pet it. If a bird flew into a window, I felt sorry for it. Foxes were simply part of the background of the town. I thought they were interesting, but I rarely thought about them for more than a few seconds. At 15, I was probably like most teenage boys. I believed my problems were much bigger than they really were. A small disagreement felt like a personal attack. Being told to clean my room or come home at a certain time could make me feel as though my parents were trying to control my whole life. I was angry often, even when I could not explain why. Sometimes the anger was real, but sometimes it was just teenage frustration with nowhere useful to go. The incident happened on a Friday evening during autumn. At least, I think it was a Friday. The air had that cold, damp feeling that arrives before winter, and dry leaves had gathered along the pavements. The sun was setting earlier each day, and by the time most people had finished dinner, the streets were already dark. That evening, I had a huge argument with my mom. I cannot remember exactly what started it, which probably means it was not important. Maybe she told me I could not go somewhere. Maybe she asked why I had not done my homework. Perhaps she complained about the mess in my room or told me to stop playing video games. Whatever it was, I reacted as if she had done something unforgivable. We shouted at each other in the kitchen. I remember her telling me to lower my voice, which only made me raise it more. My dad may have tried to calm us down, but I was too angry to listen. I felt trapped inside the house, surrounded by people who did not understand me. Of course, looking back now, I can see how dramatic I was being. At the time, however, I truly believed I was the only person being treated unfairly. Finally, I grabbed my jacket and stormed towards the front door. My mom asked where I was going, but I either ignored her or shouted that I did not know. I slammed the door behind me hard enough to shake the glass and walked away as quickly as I could. There was a small newsagent at the end of our road. The shop stayed open late and sold drinks, sweets, newspapers, and all the little things people forgot to buy at the supermarket. I went inside, bought a can of Coke, and left without saying much to the man behind the counter. A bench stood near a patch of grass beside the road, so I sat there and opened a drink. The cold metal felt good against my hand. I took long drinks while replaying the argument in my head, changing parts of it so that I always sounded clever and my mum always sounded unreasonable. I imagined all the things I should have said. I told myself that my parents did not respect me, and that one day I would leave home and never come back. Cars passed every few minutes, their headlights sweeping across the pavement. A few people walked by, but nobody paid attention to me. The temperature continued to fall, and eventually my anger began to cool as well. I still did not want to admit I had overreacted, but sitting outside alone was becoming uncomfortable. When I finished the Coke, I crushed the can slightly between my hands. It was getting late, and I knew I should return home. Part of me hoped my mum would apologize as soon as I walked through the door. Another part of me expected the argument to begin again immediately. The quickest route home took me past a small wooded area. It was only a few minutes from our house, and I had walked past it hundreds of times. During the day, it did not seem threatening. Children sometimes played among the trees, and people walked their dogs along the narrow path. At night, however, the trees became a single dark shape, and the path disappeared after only a few feet. I knew there was a rubbish bin just inside the entrance. Instead of carrying the empty can home, I stepped away from the pavement and entered the woods to throw it away. The difference between the street and the trees was immediate. Behind me, there were houses, parked cars, and yellow lights glowing through windows. In front of me, there was only darkness. The branches above blocked most of the weak light from the sky. Wet leaves covered the ground, and the air smelled of mud and damp wood. I could just make out the bin ahead of me. As I moved towards it, I noticed another shape on the ground nearby. At first, I thought it might be a cat. Then it lifted its head slightly, and I recognized the long body, pointed ears, and thick tail of a fox. It was sniffing through the leaves only a short distance from the bin. It had not noticed me, or perhaps it did not care that I was there. I stopped walking and watched it. Under normal circumstances, I probably would have stayed quiet and enjoyed seeing it. I might even have taken out my phone and tried to get a photo. But I was still full of anger from the argument. The anger had become quieter, but it was still inside me, looking for somewhere to go. I wish I could properly explain what came over me. I liked animals. I had never thrown anything at one before, yet as I stood there, holding the empty can, a stupid idea entered my mind. I thought that if I frightened the fox, I might feel powerful for a moment. After feeling controlled and helpless during the argument, I wanted something else to be afraid of me. Instead of dropping the can into the bin, I pulled my arm back and threw it at the fox. The can vanished into the darkness. A second later, I heard a dull thud. I could not see clearly enough to know whether it struck the fox or landed beside it. The sound, however, seemed heavier than an empty can hitting the ground. It sounded as though it had hit the animal. The moment I heard it, some of my anger disappeared. I expected the fox to jump and run. Foxes are usually nervous animals. They often flee at the slightest sound, especially when a person comes close. I thought it would vanish between the trees, and I would continue home feeling ashamed of myself. The fox did not move. Its dark shape remained exactly where it had been. I stood still, waiting for it to react. For a few seconds, I wondered whether I had hurt it badly. That thought made my stomach tighten. I took a small step forward, trying to see through the darkness. Then the fox slowly turned its head towards me. It did not move like a frightened animal. There was no sudden jump or quick glance. Its head turned with strange calmness, as though it had been waiting for that moment. A weak beam of light slipped through the branches and touched its face. Its eyes caught the light. Two bright white circles appeared in the darkness. I had seen animals' eyes reflect light before. Everyone has. A cat's eyes can shine green or yellow when headlights pass over them. Yet these did not look normal to me. They looked too pale, too round, and too still. They seemed less like eyes and more like two small white holes cut into the darkness. The fox stared directly at me. I could not move. A cold feeling began at the bottom of my spine and slowly climbed upwards. My arms became weak, and the skin across my neck tightened. Every natural thought told me to back away, but my legs refused to obey. The woods seemed to become completely silent. I could no longer hear traffic from the road or wind in the branches. I could not even hear the fox breathing. There was only that dark shape and those glowing eyes. I do not know how long we stared at each other. It may have been 30 seconds. It may have been a full minute. In my memory, it feels much longer. I barely breathed. The fox did not blink or shift its weight. It simply watched me. The longer it stared, the more I felt that it understood what I had done. I know how strange that sounds. A fox is an animal. It cannot judge a person in the same way another human can. But at that moment, I felt as though something behind those eyes could see every angry thought inside me. I felt small, cruel, and completely exposed. Then, without warning, the fox turned away. It walked into the darkness and disappeared between the trees. There was no sound of running paws or snapping branches. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. I continued staring at the place where it had been. I was afraid that if I moved, it would rush out from behind a tree. Eventually, the ordinary sounds of the town returned. A car passed on the road. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed. I slowly became aware of my own breathing. I backed out of the woods and hurried home. By then, the argument with my mum seemed completely unimportant. I entered the house quietly, expecting her to still be angry, but I no longer wanted to fight. I apologized, or at least behaved in a way that showed I was sorry. She was probably relieved that I had returned safely. Before long, the house felt normal again. I tried to convince myself that nothing strange had happened. I had thrown a can at a fox, and it had stared at me before leaving. That was all. I told myself that the glowing eyes were only reflected light. I probably played video games for a while or watched television with my family. By the time I went upstairs, I had almost pushed the incident from my mind. But when I got into bed and turned off the light, the fox's face returned. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those white circles floating in the dark. I tried thinking about school, my friends, games, films, anything ordinary. Somehow, every thought led back to the woods. I began to feel that the fox had followed me home. I knew it was impossible, but I kept imagining it outside the house, watching the windows. I pulled the duvet higher around my shoulders and looked towards the curtains. Eventually, I switched on the television. I kept the volume low so my parents would not hear it. The moving light filled the room and made me feel less alone. I stayed propped against my pillows, watching whatever happened to be on. At some point, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The following day was normal. I woke late, ate breakfast, and spent the Saturday doing the usual things a 15-year-old did. I may have met friends or stayed home playing games. I cannot remember clearly. Nothing unusual happened, and by evening, I had almost forgotten the fox. That night, I stayed awake late. It was around 1 in the morning when I finally went to bed. I fell asleep quickly and did not dream, at least not at first. Sometime later, small noises woke me. They came from outside the house. At first, I assumed one of the neighbors had returned home. People often came back late during the weekend. Car doors closed, garden gates squeaked, and shoes scraped across paths. I rolled over and tried to return to sleep. The sounds continued. There were little creaks and light clicking noises. They were not loud, but they were unusual enough to keep pulling my attention towards them. I could not work out where they were coming from. It sounded as though something was pressing against wood or lightly scratching a hard surface. I tried covering my head with the duvet, but that only made me listen more carefully. Eventually, I became annoyed and got out of bed. My bedroom was on the first floor, which Americans would call the second floor. It overlooked our small front garden. There was a patch of grass, a short path leading towards the front door, and a hedge separating our property from the pavement. I went to the window and looked outside. The garden was dark, but visible beneath the weak orange light from the street lamp across the road. The hedge moved slightly in the breeze. Nothing else seemed wrong. There were no people, animals, or cars arriving nearby. I stood there for a few seconds, then returned to bed. I decided the noises had probably come from a neighbor's garden or from a branch rubbing against something. Once my head touched the pillow, I quickly drifted back to sleep. I do not know how much time passed before I woke again. This time I came awake suddenly. My whole body jerked, and my heart was already beating hard. It was one of those strange moments when you cannot tell whether a real sound woke you or whether your own mind created it inside a dream. I lay still and listened. The room was silent. After a few seconds, I got out of bed and returned to the window. The street light across the road had gone out, leaving the garden almost completely black. I could still see the faint shapes of the grass and hedge, but only because my eyes were slowly adjusting to the darkness. Again, there seemed to be nothing outside. I reached for the curtain, planning to pull it closed, and returned to bed. That was when I noticed movement near the bottom of the window. At first, it was only a dark shape rising slowly into view. It appeared directly in front of the glass. My tired brain could not understand what I was seeing. There should not have been anything there. My bedroom was 1 floor above the ground, and there was no balcony, roof, tree, drainpipe, or ladder outside the window. 2 triangular shapes came into view. Ears, they rose slowly from beneath the window frame, followed by the top of a narrow head. For one confused second, I thought something must be floating outside. Then the eyes appeared. 2 glowing white discs stared through the glass, only inches from my face. I knew those eyes. They were the same eyes I had seen in the woods. Everything inside me seemed to stop. I could not breathe or shout. I could only stare back as the face continued to rise. It looked like a fox, but in that moment it did not feel like an ordinary animal. Its face was too close, too still, and far too high above the ground. The pale eyes seemed to look past my skin and into my mind. I felt that they were not simply watching me. They were warning me, They were telling me that my bedroom was not safe, my house was not safe, and there was nowhere I could hide from what I had done. Then its mouth opened. Sharp white teeth appeared beneath the glowing eyes. I fell backwards. My shoulder and hip struck the floor, and a frightened yell escaped my mouth before I could stop it. Pain moved through my side, but terror was stronger. For a second, I looked down at the carpet as I tried to push myself away from the window. When I looked back, the face was gone. There was only darkness outside the glass. I scrambled to my feet and moved towards the window again, though every part of me wanted to run from the room. I stood on my toes and looked down into the garden. Nothing was there. The grass was empty. The hedge was still. There was no animal running away, and no object beneath the window that a fox could have climbed. The wall below was flat brick. Even if a fox had somehow reached the window, there was nowhere for it to stand. I quickly pulled the curtains closed and switched on the light. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost knocked over the lamp. I expected my parents to come rushing into the room after hearing me fall, but perhaps my yell had not been as loud as it seemed. Maybe they were deeply asleep. I sat on the bed with my back against the wall. I did not dare turn off the light. Every small sound made me look towards the curtains. I imagined the fox hanging outside the window, waiting for me to open them again. For the rest of the night, I barely slept. Whenever my eyes closed, I saw the pale eyes and open mouth. I began asking myself whether I had dreamed the whole thing. Perhaps I had woken from a nightmare while standing beside the window. Maybe the sounds outside had entered my dream and created the image. But I remembered falling. My hip hurt where it had hit the floor. The fear had felt too clear and too real. As the hours passed, I thought about what I had done in the woods. I had attacked an innocent animal because I was angry with someone else. The fox had done nothing to me. It had simply been searching for food, and I had thrown something at it so that I could feel powerful. The more I considered it, the more ashamed I became. I also thought about the future. Was the fox going to return every night? Would I continue seeing its face outside the window? Would it remain outdoors, or would I wake one night and find it standing inside my room? At around 5 in the morning, after hours of fear and guilt, I made a decision. The next day, I started saving food. My family thought I was behaving strangely. At breakfast, I collected anything that was not eaten. At lunch, I did the same. At dinner, I asked everyone not to throw away their scraps. Pieces of meat, bread, and other leftovers all went into a bowl. My parents asked what I was doing. I probably gave them a weak explanation or avoided answering. Teenagers often do strange things, so perhaps they decided not to question me too much. Before bed, I carried the bowl into the front garden and placed it on the ground. It was an offering. More than that, it was an apology. I stood outside for a moment, looking towards the hedge and the dark street beyond it. Quietly, feeling slightly foolish, but also completely serious, I said I was sorry. I did not know whether I was speaking to the fox from the woods, to every fox in the neighborhood, or simply to my own guilty mind. Then I went inside. That night I heard movement in the garden. There were footsteps in the grass and small sounds near the bowl. I did not open the curtains. I stayed in bed with the light off and listened. Nothing came to the window. The next morning, the bowl was empty. From that day forward, I continued leaving food outside. Soon, several foxes began visiting regularly. Some nights, they were quiet. Other nights, they made horrible noises. Foxes can scream in ways that sound almost human. They bark cry and screech at one another while fighting over food. To someone who does not know what they are hearing, the sound can be terrifying. But those noises never frightened me in the same way again. I learned to recognize them as ordinary animals communicating and arguing. Sometimes I watched from the window as they moved through the garden. They sniffed the ground, chased one another, and carried pieces of food into the darkness. Their eyes reflected light when they looked towards the house. But they looked normal. I never again saw the pale white discs that had stared at me in the woods and outside my bedroom. Years passed. I grew older and eventually moved away from my parents' home. Since then, I have lived in 2 different houses. Each time I moved, I continued the same habit. Every night, I leave food outside for the local foxes. I know some people would say feeding wild animals is not always a good idea. I understand that. But after all these years, the habit has become something deeply personal. When I hear foxes moving outside, I feel calm. When I see them through the window, behaving like normal animals, I feel relieved. Sometimes I wonder what truly happened that night. Maybe guilt affected my mind. Perhaps I was half asleep and imagined the fox outside the upstairs window. Maybe a dream mixed with a real memory and felt completely real. The human brain can create frightening things, especially when a person is tired and ashamed. But another part of me believes something came to visit me. I do not know whether it was the fox I tried to hurt or something else using its face. I do not know how it reached my window or what would have happened if I had not fallen backwards. I only know that after I began leaving food and asking for forgiveness, nothing strange ever happened again. The foxes still come at night. They walk across the garden, their bodies almost invisible in the darkness. Sometimes they stop and look towards my window. Their eyes shine briefly before they turn away. I like to believe I was forgiven. Whether that forgiveness came from the creature in the woods or from my own mind, I cannot say. I am simply grateful that I never saw that face again.